In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, not merely a particle of speech, but the very act of reason itself.
Christianity was born into a world defined by the polis, where Greek curiosity forged the literary notion of allegory.
The first generations of Christians were Jews who lived in a world shaped by the thought of Plato, a supreme deity immune to passion.
They had to reconcile this perfect God with the God of Israel, a deity passionately concerned with human response. Out of this tangle of Greek reason and Jewish memory, the construction of Christianity began.
Centuries before the Messiah, a great dispersal had begun. The diaspora, millions of Jews living far from the hills of Judea.
By the 1st century, these communities were established in every major port, thriving on the empire's vast trade routes.
Without a temple, the synagogue became their anchor, a center for the study of the law and the preservation of identity.
But the ancestral tongue was fading. In the great library of Alexandria, the Hebrew scriptures were mirrored into Greek.
The Septuagint. This Greek translation unwittingly forged the very vocabulary of the future Christian faith. Philo of Alexandria sought a synthesis, using Greek allegory to prove that the God of Israel was the God of reason.
While the Jews prepared the mind, Rome prepared the earth. The Pax Romana, an unprecedented political unity.
Roman legions ensured a world without local wars or bandits, turning the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. Travel was constant. Merchants, slaves, and artisans moved across the sea lanes with newfound ease and safety. Rome's calling was to civilize, to cityfy the world. Where there were no cities, they hewed them out of the wilderness.
Their policy was one of tolerance, yet they encouraged a quiet uniformity through the worship of the emperor.
Syncretism was the fashion. Gods were mixed and matched, creating a cultural chaos in the shadow of political order. But the Jews, and later the Christians, were seen as unbending fanatics, an alien cyst within the body of the empire.
A single currency and a single law provided the stability that a tiny sect would one day exploit to conquer the world.
Roman citizenship offered protection. For the Apostle Paul, it was the ultimate passport for a universal mission.
They found an audience already waiting, the God-fearers. Gentiles who loved the God of Israel but feared the burden of the law.
The stage was set. The roads were paved. The language was shared. The time had fully come.
In an obscure village in Galilee, a movement began that would graft itself onto this global infrastructure. It was a tangle of Greek reason, Roman peace, and Jewish memory. It was the birth of the Word in history.
History was about to be grafted onto a crucified Messiah, a carpenter's son whose execution would change the cosmos. Within a century, the movement faced the crushing power of Rome, a city whose only assets were its energies in war. In the shadow of the Roman peace, history took an intimate turn. A carpenter's son from Nazareth began to speak. His ministry was a paradox, born in Galilee, yet centered on a collision with the religious and political heart of Jerusalem. He moved through a micro-region of ecological variety, calling those whom the world had labeled as infinitesimal.
His words were the Beatitudes, a subversive anthem for the hungry, the weeping, and the hated.
He taught a new morality, that the Creator sought a response of love, not merely the observance of ritual purity. To the authorities, he was a political threat. To the poor, he was a glimpse of a kingdom that would reverse their fortunes.
The final journey led to the temple, a vast complex of stones and secrets that he claimed he would rebuild in 3 days.
The Last Supper, a meal taken during the Passover, grafting the new message onto the ancient memory of liberation.
In Gethsemane, the human will wrestled with the divine economy. A moment of absolute agony before the arrest.
Pontius Pilate, a coarse-grained soldier, found himself cross-questioning a prisoner who spoke of a kingdom not of this world.
The titulus. A record of Roman execution that unwittingly proclaimed a cosmic coronation.
The scandal of the cross. An execution intended to end a movement, but which became its ultimate signature. Then came the silence. The tomb was sealed, and the disciples were scattered in fear and disappointment.
But the tomb was found empty, a claim that contradicted the laws of physics and galvanizing the survivors.
On the road to Emmaus, a meal of recognition became the church's breaking of bread, a celebration of the resurrected one.
The Ascension. A literal departure that left behind a community possessed by an extraordinary, galvanizing energy.
Pentecost. The Spirit's arrival transformed the disciples from fearful villagers into bold proclaimers of a world faith. In Jerusalem, the early ecclesia was led by James, the brother of the Lord, a church that was still entirely Jewish.
The movement was no longer local. It spoke the tongues of the world, even before it crossed a single border.
The tangle of Jewish memory and Greek reason was now irreversible. The Logos had entered history.
Paul of Tarsus, a citizen of Rome, was about to graft the Messiah's message onto the empire's global infrastructure.
Antioch, the gateway where followers were first called Christiani, a Latin nickname for a Greek message about a Jewish life.
The roads were paved, and the mission began. From Jerusalem to the very ends of the earth.
In the year 355, the lakeside city of Nicaea became the center of the known world.
Over 250 bishops gathered, some still bearing the physical marks of imperial torture. The assembly waited for one man, Constantine, the first ruler to weave the cross into the imperial standard.
For Constantine, this was more than theology. It was a quest for a unity that could hold his fractured empire together.
At the heart of the storm was Arius, a priest from Alexandria who sought to make the faith intellectually respectable.
Arius proposed a God who was solitary and unoriginate, making the Son a creature, noble yet distinct from the Father.
He was countered by Athanasius, who argued that if the Son were a creature, the very bridge of salvation would collapse into the abyss.
The debate centered on a single, unbiblical Greek word, homoousios, affirming that the Son was of the same substance as the Father.
Constantine himself championed the formula, sensing that the unity of God must be mirrored in the unity of the throne.
The result was the Nicene symbol, a creed not merely of unanimity, but of a collective will to remain one.
It was the first ecumenical council, a victory of order over the chaos of individual interpretation.
Arius was banished, and for the first time, a civil sentence followed an ecclesiastical judgment.
But Constantine's vision reached further. He began building a new Rome on the site of ancient Byzantium.
Constantinople, a city where pagan temples were excluded, replaced by grand Christian basilicas like the first Hagia Sophia.
The emperor commissioned 50 monumental copies of the Bible, an extraordinary investment in the written word.
In the Holy Land, the emperor's mother, Helena, sought to touch history itself, claiming to discover the wood of the cross.
The church adopted the form of the Roman basilica. The halls of power were now the houses of prayer.
The bishop's chair, the cathedra, became a symbol of authority as the clergy began to dress in the robes of imperial courtiers.
But this newfound splendor created an inner tension. Many began to fear that the soul of the faith was being lost in the glitter of the world.
A new exodus began. Thousands fled the imperial church for the silence of the desert.
Anthony, the pioneer of the hermits, spent decades wrestling with demons in the isolation of abandoned forts.
Soon, solitary hermits became communities. Pachomius organized the desert into hives of prayer and manual labor. The desert became a parallel empire, a society based on obedience, poverty. By the middle of the 4th century, the cross was everywhere. It was jewelry, it was law, it was the signature of a new age.
Constantine's journey ended with baptism on his deathbed, leaving behind an empire that was, at least in name, Christian.
By the 5th century, the one church began to fracture into 3 distinct linguistic and cultural families: Latin, Greek, and Oriental.
Language became a theological frontier, where clumsy translations of intricate Greek terms created an irreversible international tangle. In the West, the Bishop of Rome emerged as a stabilizing monarchy, asserting a spiritual authority that would outlast the emperors.
Pope Leo the Great.
Leo's tome sought to settle the mystery of Christ, but in the East, it was seen as a betrayal of the truth of Alexandria.
In 451, at Chalcedon, the church issued its most difficult definition.
This Chalcedonian definition sought to capture the paradox of the God-man, yet it shattered the unity of the Mediterranean world. Egypt and Syria rejected the two-nature formula, adhering instead to Cyril's vision of a single, unified, divine human nature.
The Miaphysites became a church of the people, a Coptic and Syriac identity forged in defiance of the imperial throne.
Armenia, the first nation to embrace Christianity en masse, eventually cast its lot with the dissenters, choosing national faith over Roman decree.
Scholar monks like Mesrop Mastoch devised a new alphabet, making the Bible the very foundation of Armenian culture.
Beyond the Roman borders, the Church of the East flourished in Persia, existing as a tenuous and often persecuted minority.
Under Shapur II, tens of thousands were martyred, as the Persian state viewed Christians as a Roman fifth column.
Persian saying. Yet from this trauma arose the demonstrations of Afrahat, the Persian sage.
Mysticism evolved from solitary hermits into vast hives of prayer and labor, a parallel society for those fleeing a worldly church. Basil the Great taught that the bread withheld from the hungry belongs to them. He sold his family's prestige to feed the starving.
Basil built a new city, a hospice of mercy that became the prototype for every hospital in the Western world.
In the silence of Bethlehem, the stormy scholar Jerome forged the Vulgate, a Latin Bible that would govern the mind of Europe for a millennium.
Jerome was aided by a circle of learned women, like Paula, who mastered Hebrew and financed the infrastructure of sacred scholarship.
In 410, the unthinkable occurred. Rome fell. The mother of nations was turned into a grave, and the world shook.
From his cell in Bethlehem, Jerome wept for the city that had conquered the world, believing the end of the era was at hand.
Toleleye, toleleye.
Augustine wrote The City of God to explain that while earthly empires crumble, the spiritual commonwealth of the faithful is eternal. Augustine died as the Vandals laid siege to his city, leaving behind a theology of grace that would haunt and inspire the West forever.
The sun set on the ancient world. Out of the wreckage of Rome, the church became the sole heir to the glory and the burden of the past.
By the 6th century, Constantinople was a moon landing of a city.
Emperor Justinian sought to sacralize the state. codifying 5 centuries of law into a single Christian framework. Beside him stood Theodora, a former circus artist turned empress, whose stele will often governed the church's deepest divides. The dome was a helmet of heaven, an architectural claim that the earthly empire was a microcosm of the celestial court.
No humble shepherd here. This is the Pantocrator, a stern judge mirroring the emperor's absolute might.
Beneath the pomp rose Theosis, the daring belief that through deep prayer, man becomes divine.
Maximus the Confessor paid for this theology in blood, his tongue cut and hand amputated for defending the full humanity of Christ's will. Maximus argued that in the garden, Christ used a human will to obey the divine, a union of nature that respected the integrity of the created. By the 7th century, the world felt out of control. Plagues decimated the population, and enemies encamped at the city's very gates.
Believers turned to icons for protection, seeing in the Virgin Mary a heavenly general who led the defense of the new Rome.
But a new tide was rising from the south, from the forgotten deserts of the Arabian Peninsula.
In a cave near Mecca, a merchant named Muhammad heard a voice that would realign the spiritual map of the world.
The Quran arrived as extraordinary poetry, a final revelation that claimed the heritage of the religions of the book.
In a decade of lightning conquest, the armies of Islam occupied the oldest centers of the Christian faith.
Umar entered Jerusalem in humility, treating the conquered with a forbearance that the Christian emperors had often lacked.
The Dome of the Rock was built to mark a victory over Christianity, a building as impressive as any church, inscribed with rebukes to the Trinity. Christians became dhimmis, second-class citizens protected by a pact, their faith now a private matter in a Muslim world.
The centers of Christian gravity shifted. Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem were lost to the political center of the faith.
By the 8th century, Baghdad was more a likely capital for worldwide Christianity than Rome.
Driven by trade and mission, Syrian merchants took their faith thousands of miles east, beyond any political support. In 635, Alapin reached the Chinese capital of Chang'an. The luminous religion had arrived at the edge of the world. They translated their faith into sutras, using the language of Taoism and Buddhism to explain the Word made flesh. The Nestorian stele of 781 remains a silent witness to a Christianity that was once a pillar of imperial Chinese life. Monasteries were built in the shadow of the Luguan Temple, where the cross and the Tao lived in a brief, extraordinary synthesis.
This was a polycentric faith, youthful and varied, proving that the Logos could speak every language of the earth.
Christmas year 800, the Empire reborn, a holy union of the Frankish sword and Roman mitre.
The Carolingian Renaissance brought a standardization of the word, creating a script that is the direct ancestor of the typeface you read today.
The faith now traveled north, turning the fierce Norsemen from the scourge of Christendom into its most dedicated defenders.
As imperial secular power withered in Italy, the Bishop of Rome emerged as the sole anchor of stability, the consul of God.
A single word, filioque, became an ideological frontier, a theological addition that would eventually tear the church in two.
As the first millennium passed, Europe clothed itself in a white mantle of churches, a stone signature of a world renewed.
At Cluny, a monastic revolution began. For 200 years, its abbots would lead a movement for prayer and political freedom.
Cluny created the first international religious organization, binding hundreds of independent houses under a single, rigorous command. The Great Schism. A personal excommunication in 1054 became a permanent divorce between the Latin West and the Greek East. Hildebrand, Pope Gregory VII, asserted that even emperors were subject to the keys of Peter, setting the stage for total confrontation.
At Canossa, the most powerful ruler in Europe, waited 3 days in the snow to beg for the pardon of a priest.
1095, Urban II's call to liberate the Holy Land unleashed a religious energy that would transform both East and West.
The First Crusade, an armed pilgrimage that sought to merge the Knight's Code with the martyr's hope.
Jerusalem fell in 1099, resulting in a brief, blood-soaked Latin kingdom at the heart of the Islamic world.
New orders emerged, the soldier monks, Templars and Hospitallers who vowed poverty and chastity, yet lived by the blade.
The 12th century brought a different rebirth, the rise of cities, trade, and a new hunger for systematic knowledge.
Universities were born, centers of intellectual combat, where reason was used to probe the deepest mysteries of faith.
Scholasticism was born of dispute. It was a method of questioning, asserting, and eventually harmonizing the authorities of the past.
Anselm of Canterbury sought a logic so pure that it would prove God's existence through the very definition of perfection itself.
Peter Abelard dared to doubt, insisting that theology must not merely repeat the past, but reconcile its contradictions.
The Mendicant Revolution. A new kind of monk appeared, one who abandoned the cloister to live by begging in the streets.
Francis of Assisi married Lady Poverty, seeing God not in an unmoved mover, but in the person of his suffering Lord.
Dominic de Guzman sought an order of preachers, men equipped with the finest education to defend the truth through persuasion.
Thomas Aquinas, the giant of the age, forged a synthesis of Christian faith and the rediscovered reason of Aristotle. The Summa, a monument of the mind that presented a harmonious view of God's earthly and heavenly creation.
By the 14th century, the high noon of the Middle Ages began to fade into a long and wintry shadow.
The Black Death arrived, a biological cataclysm that wiped out a third of the continent, shaking the very foundations of the social order. Faced with divine wrath, some sought salvation in blood. The flagellants marched through towns, performing a second baptism of pain, dirty. For 70 years, the popes resided not in Rome, but in Avignon, a period Petrarch.
As the fear of death mounted, the industry of purgatory blossomed. Salvation became a matter of accounting and the sale of indulgences.
Pope Boniface VIII asserted the absolute power of the keys of Peter over all earthly monarchs, but his pride met its match in the French crown.
The Council of Constance finally resolved the deadlock, asserting that a general council held authority even over the Pope.
For 70 years, the popes resided not in Rome, but in Avignon, a period Petrarch dubbed the Babylonian captivity of the Church.
The Church became a tool of French policy, alienating the rest of Europe and deepening the sense of a moral vacuum at the center.
Voices of conscience, like Catherine of Siena, pleaded with the Sweet Father in Avignon to return to the city of the Apostles.
The return to Rome sparked the Great Western Schism. Christendom was torn apart as two, and later three, nations took sides based on politics, not piety. The seamless robe of Christ was shredded by the ambitions of the cardinals.
The Council of Constance finally resolved the deadlock, asserting that a general council held authority even over the Pope.
But the council sought to restore order by fire. Before they healed the schism, they turned their attention to the heretics.
In England, John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation, attacked the corruption of the clergy and the wealth of the church.
His followers, the Lollards, carried the English scriptures into the villages, teaching that the Bible was the only final authority.
The council condemned the deceased Wycliffe, ordering his body exhumed and his ashes scattered into the river Swift. In Bohemia, John Huss combined Wycliffe's ideas with Czech nationalism, preaching that an unworthy pope is not to be obeyed.
Promised safe conduct by the emperor, Huss instead found a trap. He refused to deny what he believed to be the truth of Scripture.
In 1415, Huss was burned as a heretic. But his death sparked a flame that no crusade could extinguish.
The Hussite Wars began, a series of revolutionary conflicts that forced the Catholic Church to its first major compromise. The Hussites demanded the cup for the laity, a symbol of the spiritual equality of all believers before God.
The medieval canopy was fracturing. Christendom was no longer a single, unified block, but a landscape of gathering storms.
As the structures of the past withered, an intellectual rebirth began. Scholars looked back to the sources of classical antiquity.
The cry was ad fontes, back to the sources. It was the birth of the Renaissance and the final stage before the Reformation. By the 15th century, Italy began to dig into its own past, unearthing the statues and the spirit of a lost, classical world.
This was the Renaissance, a rebirth that sought to replace medieval bookhand with the clarity of ancient eloquence.
Authority now demanded a source. Textual criticism was born, unmasking long-accepted legends as clumsy medieval forgeries.
In 1439, Johann Gutenberg's movable type transformed the word from a guarded secret into an unstoppable, printed force.
For the first time, an individual with the right intellectual skills could outface the most long-lasting authority in Europe, the Church.
Erasmus of Rotterdam brought a sense of irony to the divine, urging a return to the Greek sources of the faith.
Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, mocking the superstitions and moral decay of the ecclesiastical elite.
In Rome, the Renaissance popes were more like warlords and merchant princes than humble shepherds of the soul.
Calixtus III and Alexander VI turned the papacy into a family business, defined by nepotism and sensual pleasure.
Julius II, the warrior pope, sought to restore Rome's architectural and military glory through the force of arms. To pay for this splendor, Leo X authorized a massive sale of indulgences. Salvation turned into a matter of accounting.
Tetzel promised that, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. The bargain was struck.
In a cell in Wittenberg, an Augustinian monk named Martin Luther was wrestling with a God of absolute and terrifying justice. His breakthrough was a discovery of grace. Not that we make ourselves righteous, but that God declares us so through faith.
In 1517, Luther posted his 985 Theses, a call for debate that ignited a global revolution.
When Rome issued a bull of excommunication, Luther burned it, publicly severing his ties with the institutional church. In 1521, at the Diet of Worms, the monk faced the emperor. The stability of the Holy Roman Empire was at stake.
Commanded to recant, Luther replied that his conscience was captive to the word of God. Here I stand, I can do no other.
In hidden exile, he translated the Bible into the language of the people, turning the word into a common heritage for every hearth.
Religion retreated from the sphere of public ritual into the world of the mind and the individual imagination.
Luther's theology of the cross undid the reliance on works, offering a liberating, if controversial, new morality.
The printing press became the first medium of mass propaganda, ensuring that the monk's message reached every corner of Europe.
The medieval canopy was gone. Christendom was no longer a single block, but a landscape of gathering religious and political storms. The freedom of a Christian was soon interpreted by the poor as a call to social justice, leading to a blood-soaked peasants' war. History had reached its tipping point. The word had entered the marketplace, and the West would never be one again. While princes fought over creeds, the radicals, the Anabaptists, recalled a time when the church was a community of choice, not a mandate of the state.
Menno Simons turned a violent dream of a new Jerusalem into a quiet, enduring pacifism, seeking the spirit of the Sermon on the Mount.
Ignatius Loyola turned military discipline inward to found the Jesuits, the Pope's new spiritual army.
At Trent, the Catholic Church shed its medieval rules, becoming a Tridentine fortress against the Protestant tide.
Francis Xavier carried this renewed faith to the Indies, starting a global expansion that would make Catholicism the first truly world faith.
A theater of faith. Here, counter-Reformation art and native traditions merged into a spiritual synthesis.
But the price of certainty was blood. The 30 Years' War exhausted Europe, breeding a new, cynical indifference to religious dogma.
René Descartes sought a new certainty in reason alone, carving a dualism between the material body and the thinking ghost.
Isaac Newton saw the universe as a perfect mechanism of God, yet his logic began to dismiss the complexities of the Trinity. Baruch Spinoza dared to suggest that God and nature were one, turning the Bible into a subject for cold, historical scrutiny.
In England, John Wesley ignored church boundaries to bring a religion of the heart to the masses ignored by the elite.
1789. The French Revolution radicalized doubt, seeking to replace the cross with the cult of the supreme being.
The Industrial Revolution uprooted millions, challenging a church-parish system that was rooted in the slow pace of the countryside.
Charles Darwin shattered the watchmaker argument, proposing a struggle for existence that robbed the world of moral purpose.
The quest for the historical Jesus found only a reflection of the scholars themselves. Jesus remained a stranger to the modern age.
Rome reacted with the syllabus of errors and papal infallibility, building a rampart of dogma against the rising tide of modernity.
In 1906, the Spirit was set free on Azusa Street, replacing dogma with the fire of direct experience.
Facing the darkness of Nazism, Dietrich Bonhoeffer prophesied a religionless Christianity that would find God on the cross.
John the 23rd called for an aggiornamento, opening the windows to let fresh air into a church that had been closed for centuries.
In Latin America, the preferential option for the poor turned theology into a tool for social liberation.
The center of gravity shifted. Africa and the global south became the new heartlands of a faith once thought to be European.
In Korea, patriotism and faith forged a new dynamism, proving that Christianity is a youth movement at the periphery.
Today, we live beyond Christendom. The faith is polycentric, a global argument about meaning in a postmodern world.
The Logos remains, yet it speaks every language, fitting no single culture, belonging to all humanity. The story is not finished. It is an unfinished narrative, and we are now its narrators.